Welcome to the second episode of the playlist, Things You Didn't Know About the Holocaust. I'm Phyllis Zimbler Miller, and I have as my guest today Dr. Amy Simon, who is the William and Audrey Farber Family Chair in Holocaust Studies and European Jewish History at Michigan State University, my undergraduate alma mater, and she's the author of the book Emotions in Yiddish Ghetto Diaries. And what I just have to say is, I just this past summer took a graduate level course with Dr. Simon on Holocaust Diaries. So I'm very excited to get to talk to her today and let her tell you the difference between diaries and Holocaust memoirs, which I learned. So, first, let's just say a welcome and tell us about your work.
Sure. Well, thank you for having me here. I appreciate it, and I appreciated the invitation, and glad that the class that we did on diaries was impactful, and I am always an advocate for thinking about and understanding Holocaust diaries. So happy to be here. My work does revolve around Holocaust diaries, especially those written in Yiddish in Poland and areas that had recently been Poland during World War II and during the Holocaust. So my work very much focuses on the ghetto experience of the Holocaust, which is often overlooked for explanations and accounts of concentration camps, which is much more widely known by lay people and taught in educational settings. So I really focus on diaries because of the daily lived experience that people had sometimes for years in these places. And it's my opinion as a scholar that this is an important site of understanding something about humanity and how humanity develops in this moment where you're kind of in between. On the one hand, many freedoms were taken away in the ghettos. Obviously, people were enclosed and people were restricted in very, very many ways. On the other hand, they were still doing the kinds of things that you might do in daily life, like working and going to school and holding cultural events. So it was this real, this kind of, mix of restricted and allowed. And to me, that's a really fascinating moment to try to understand how do people respond, how do people change, how do people deal with experiences as things are happening to them. So it's a very chaotic is a word that I use a lot, but also just a very changeable situation in which people are constantly having to adapt. So I find that really interesting for historical research and for understanding the people.
Now, I just want to remind listeners, as I spoke about yesterday in the first episode, when we talked about the Ludge and we decided we would call it Ludge Ghetto, is that many people might think, if you've ever visited Venice and you saw the Venice Ghetto and stuff, that it just was an isolated community, but basically everything within it was okay. So Dr. Simon is going to explain some of the horrible, horrible conditions in these ghettos, including that the main purpose of the ghettos was to make sure all the Jews died. It was not to make sure the Jews lived and became productive. It was to make sure that if they worked for the Germans, the Nazis, they were productive for the war effort, but basically they should die. So,
Yeah, and it's also important to note that there were so many kinds of ghettos. I do think something that a lot of people don't realize, maybe people know about the Warsaw Ghetto because it was the largest, and there was the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which was very famous, became a very important kind of touchstone in Jewish history because basically the Jewish inhabitants held off the Nazis for a month, which is kind of impossible to imagine that level of success, although ultimately they were defeated and killed. But there were thousands of ghettos all across occupied Europe, thousands and thousands. And so every ghetto had its own situation. They were not all enclosed. Some of them housed 200 people, and it was kind of like in a field, and maybe there was a guard, and sometimes it was, thousands of people, but then within a month they were sent to a larger ghetto like Warsaw. Warsaw and Lodz were constantly getting people sent in from surrounding territories as they were trying to concentrate the Jews into smaller and smaller areas to control them and control everything about their lives, which exactly um, led to illness, death, and then eventually deportation and death. And so, yeah, so ghettos were very, very different, but the ones we know the most about, of course, are the largest ones. The reason we know the most about the largest ones is because there are the most survivors from those places just by numbers, and also because there were documentary projects in all of the largest ghettos. And so what I mean by documentary projects is Jewish people within the ghettos who took it upon themselves to record what happened to them because they knew the Nazis would never tell the world about the details of what they went through, the suffering they endured, the terrible rations they had, the lack of medical facilities, but also the, cultural things they did and the education they carried out. So nobody would ever know about both the suffering and the resistance if they didn't record it. And so they were, I mean, brilliant really to understand that and then to take steps to document and then to smuggle out the documents, hide the documents, somehow try to rescue the documents. And this happened in Warsaw, this happened in Lodz, this happened in Vilna, this happened in Bialystok, it happened in all of the major ghettos around Europe as people were trying to make sure that the world knew what was happening to them. So there were a lot of different kinds of ghettos, but we know the most about the big ones because we have a lot more documentation from those places.
And I just want to say that they didn't all open at the same time and they weren't all liquidated at the same time. So it's very important when talking about, and not necessarily we'll get in right today, but if you're reading about it and you go, oh, how does that, go with other ones, that you need to know what years you're talking about, where the war is, how the war is going for the Germans, and how the Russians later in the year in the war years are progressing east. And so ghettos sometimes were liquidated based on the fact that the Russians might come upon them sooner rather than later. So what I've asked Dr. Simon to do is tell us some of the things that she's found the most little known about some of these experiences.
Yeah, so I guess I'll start with what my book is about, or else maybe I'll start broader because as we are in this setting and thinking about things that people don't know about the Holocaust, in my experience teaching Holocaust, basically since 2000, really teaching on my own since 2009, so it's been a while. The vast majority of students that I encounter, again, know very little, if nothing, about the ghetto. So I imagine that will be the same for people watching this channel. So generally speaking, I'll say that there's an enormous amount that people don't know about ghettos and the conditions in the ghettos, and also that it's tricky because ghettos were different. So I can say ghettos, but I can't mean all 1,500 or however many exactly there are ghettos. What I mean is the ones that I know the best, which are the largest ones. I can tell you about the kinds of restrictions that happen there, which is going to be parallel, but not exactly the same to some of the, especially the smaller ones. And so conditions in the ghettos generally, again, the idea, and maybe this is something people don't actually realize, the idea when Hitler invaded Germany, when the Nazis invaded Germany in
They
September,
invaded
September,
Poland. Invaded
sorry,
Poland.
yeah. They were
Okay.
from Germany. They invaded Poland on
September 1st,
September 1,
1939.
1939. And at that moment, there was not a final solution as a policy. That didn't exist. The idea was there. Hitler had written about it in 1923 already in his, in his memoir, Mein Kampf. So the ideas were there, the discussions were there, but there was not a plan. This was a war of aggression and expansion. So they do the war, they start the war, and what happens that is really comes as a struggle for them is that anti-Judaism and laws against Jews, persecutions of Jews, wanting to get rid of Jews had been central to German policy since 1933, but there were about 500,000 Jews in Germany, about 1/2 of 1% of the German population, and about half of those left under duress, right, from all the threats and anti-Jewish laws and so forth by the start of the war. So, all things considered, this is a pretty small number of Jews. Once they invade Poland, they come upon, a little bit at a time as they move east, 3 million Jews. And so immediately there has to be some kind of plan, right? What are they going to do with these Jews? If central to Nazi ideology is getting rid of Jews, what are they going to do? So they don't have that plan all set out, right? So Auschwitz is not even a dream in somebody's, mind in September of 1939. So what do they do instead? They try to find all the Jews in all the places they go, and they come up with, there's a lot of complicated policy. You can read books and books about how the ghettos were developed and who came up with this law and then. But generally speaking, the idea was to concentrate Jews, to make sure they couldn't cause trouble, to separate them using the divide and conquer, right? Separating them, for example, from Poles so that they couldn't gang up together against the Germans. Obviously, the Poles didn't want the Nazis to be there any more than the Jews did because this was their country. There was also vast persecution against the Poles, who were considered just right above Jews in terms of an idea of racial categorization that the Nazis had. So, so there were various reasons for, trying to separate Jews out of society, but that was the plan. The plan was not necessarily kill them all, but then it developed during the time, once Jews were kind of in these areas, the question was, well, who's going to feed them? Right? What are we going to do with these people? What are they going to do? What are we going to do? We don't want to spend money on Jews. Obviously, we want to get rid of them. And so, again, there's an enormous amount of complicated policy back and forth as to, different ideas about what to do with these Jews. Do we ship them out? Do we send them to Madagascar somehow? Do we concentrate them in the general government, which was kind of the central area of Poland? After Nazis divided Poland up. Maybe we make they called it like a reservation for Jews. Maybe we just put them all there. They didn't really know what to do, but they knew they weren't going to treat the Jews well because the whole point was eventually to get rid of them, either to kill them or to get rid of them.
Am I correct that in the beginning they didn't really think about how they had this slave labor force? They didn't realize that they could use, and there was some controversy within the German higher ups as to not understanding that they could use them for the war effort.
Yeah, not understanding and also the ideology. Some of the higher ups were strict ideologues and they just want to get rid of the Jews. The Jewish question is the problem, we need a solution. Whereas others in the Nazi higher ups said, wait a minute, we can exploit these people. There are millions of people. We have this, especially as the war was ongoing, right? We
Right.
need people to work. And not only, by the way, were they exploiting Jewish slave laborers, they were deporting people from all over every country that they entered. They deported people from there back into Germany to work for them as slave laborers. All over, from France, from the Netherlands, from
And we're
Poland,
talking not
from
Jews here. They took inhabitants of those countries,
yeah,
snatched them off the street.
non-Jews. Absolutely. So there were millions of people working as slave laborers for the Nazis, including Jews. So yes, this develops over time, but yeah, exactly. The first idea was contain them. And in some ways, and I don't know like the timing to say exactly what developed when, but in some places, and I'm thinking of Bialystok and Lodz in particular, um, the ghetto administration itself came up with the idea to make itself into a productive workforce for the Nazis as a way of trying to survive, right? The idea was if people were going to, if they were going to be valuable as laborers, then perhaps they wouldn't be killed, since that was clearly the object was to make them suffer in some way because of the terrible conditions that were imposed. So that's what happened in a lot of places, like I said, especially Lodz and Bialystok, where the leaders took on that as a very strong kind of idea of how to help the whole ghetto survive. Among many things that maybe people don't know about the ghettos is one of the things that did was create social hierarchies that were in a lot of ways really backwards from what it looked like in pre-war life, meaning who got the most food? Well, the youngest and the fittest. Who died first? The children and the elderly who couldn't work and therefore couldn't get food. In life beforehand, especially Jewish communal life, the elderly and the children were well respected, well cared for, right? The elderly as the, kind of leaders of the community and the youth as the next generation. But instead, these people became the first to really suffer and to die because of the new hierarchy that was developed in this like survival through work idea. So there are a lot of parts kind of moving together. There's the Nazis and the organization and the laws and the decrees coming from outside. But then in every ghetto, and this was maybe not every ghetto because there were so many, but in the vast majority of ghettos, one of the first things the Nazis did was they required the Jews to come up with a Jewish council, which consisted of 24 members, men, who were, presumably community leaders, and then a head of the council. And these people were meant to be kind of the go-between between the Nazi authorities and the Jewish population. And so this became the way that they communicated, and every Jewish council had its own character, right? They had its own leader, it had its own group of people that had different ideas about how much to cooperate versus how much to resist, how to resist or how to cooperate, what that should look like, what it should mean for people in the ghetto. So every place really people's lives were very much impacted by how that council interacted. And just to note, and a good example is Vilna. In the Vilna ghetto, the first council was not uh, doing what the Nazis wanted them to do, and they were murdered, and a new council was developed. So it was, it may sound kind of like Jews had some agency that they could like be a go-between and negotiate or discuss with the Nazi authorities. And that was true, like to this limit where if the Nazis didn't like it, they could just, and that was a known thing. They could just kill anybody at any time, right? There was no safety didn't exist. And so it was just about trying to figure out ways to survive day to day without angering the Nazis to the point where they might just kill you, kill your family, kill as many people as they wanted.
Now, can we talk just briefly about escape from the ghettos? Uh, some people did escape. People knew that escaping could risk the lives of who they left behind. But let's talk a little bit because people always say, why didn't the Jews resist? Well, first of all, they didn't have weapons, but go ahead, you tell them.
Yeah, so I mean, didn't the Jews resist is one question, and why didn't the Jews escape is another one, because as we know, resistance could mean everything, including things like I already talked about having cultural events, education for children. That's an amazing form of resistance, right? If
Yeah.
the goal is to get rid of Jews, then, educating young Jews is showing a confidence in a future and
Educating non-Jews against Nazi decrees not to educate them.
right, exactly. Right. Illegally educating Jewish children within the ghettos. And so all of those things are resistance. Writing diaries could be seen as resistance. Certainly the archival projects that I mentioned were resistance because the Nazis didn't want this information out.
Money records.
Yeah, and people were writing these things and rescuing and trying to save them at the risk to their own lives, very much so. These are very secret programs because otherwise, if they were found, they could have life and death ramifications. So there's that kind of resistance, but escape is a really interesting question. And this is another one that is really place dependent. So the two like really great examples are Lodz and Warsaw because Lodz, and we kind of talked about this for a minute before, was in the area of Germany that they immediately annexed into Germany, and Lodz became kind of the center of their colonial project. So the idea was that they were going to get rid of the Poles and the Jews by and large, bring in a bunch of Germans, and this was the whole idea of Lebensraum, right? The resettlement, the growth of the German people, giving them living space in the new territories. So this was kind of the first experiment in this area of the German Reich that they of Poland that they annexed into the German Reich. And so Lodz is there. They therefore immediately cleanse Lodz of all Jews by putting them in this ghetto that is heavily secured with walls and barbed wire and guards. And there's like a mile no man's land in between the ghetto and the outside world. So it's virtually impossible for people to get in and out of this ghetto. It's one of the most difficult ghettos to escape from, even if they wanted to, had the, money or wherewithal to find a way. Anybody from either side was risking life, risking their lives to try to escape. Warsaw, on the other hand, was enormously porous, surprisingly, given the fact that it was also surrounded by,
Let's clarify.
yes,
Warsaw was in a different category of German occupied land. It was in
yes,
what was called the general government. Yeah, now go ahead
yeah.
and explain.
And so exactly. So the general government was that central portion of Poland, and that was again at that time early in the ghetto experience in the war as they were coming up with ideas for Jews before the final solution. And I should say also the final solution was kind of ratified and sent down from on high, meaning the murder of all European Jews in January of 1942. So
Yes,
there's
at the
some
Wannsee conference that
at
people
the
went
Wannsee
to.
conference, exactly. So there's time in which these ghettos are operating, people are suffering, people are dying in large numbers because of malnutrition and terrible conditions and also
Random shootings,
murder. What's that?
and
Yeah, random
random shootings
shootings,
by the Nazi
exactly.
guards.
All kinds of reasons. But this like full on final solution policy is not ratified till January 42. So there's a lot of time, and most of the ghettos are, by 1940, pretty well in central Poland are pretty well organized.
Right. Okay, so wait, because I interrupted you. The
Yeah,
Warsaw Ghetto is formed several months after the Lodz Ghetto. And let's go back to escape from the Warsaw Ghetto because of how
yeah,
its configuration was different. So explain how
yes.
it abutted the city.
Exactly. So the Warsaw Ghetto was created, most of the ghettos actually, but Warsaw Ghetto was created in an area of central Warsaw that was a bad neighborhood, let's just say. They often did this because obviously if you're going to put a bunch of people that are unwanted people, you're not going to put them in the nice areas of town. Parts of it didn't have running water and electricity. It's kind of like we might imagine tenements or something today. And so they decided, and there was an old, like the poorest of the Jews lived in this area, and then they forced all the Jews from the city to also move into this area. And so it was way too small for the number of people. There were about 450,000 people at the
In the
highest
Warsaw Ghetto.
in Warsaw Ghetto. So this was a large number of people in a very small living space, and in really terrible conditions, even before all the restrictions. It was walled. But because so it was walled with brick walls and there's guards all around, and it was illegal to go out unless you were with a work brigade. There were work brigades that went in and out. There were private companies and individuals that employed Jews. They were not slave laborers for them because they paid the German government for the use of these people. But so there were groups of people that could go in and out. There were official kind of guard or gatehouses where, people would go in and out for those purposes, always under guard and so forth. But because Warsaw was in the middle of the city, it became very common for certain groups of people to sneak out and to sneak back in, usually for the purpose of smuggling. And so it turns out that in Warsaw, this is an astonishing number, but about 80% of the food materials in the Warsaw Ghetto were smuggled in from outside. And so even though hunger was still rampant, and of course this led to all kinds of social hierarchies. If you were a smuggler, you ate a whole lot better than if you weren't, and so forth. If you were wealthy and could buy the smuggled foods, you did much better. So there was all kinds of ramifications, but there was a constant flux of people in and out, especially children. So children, because they were small, because they were relatively fearless in the way children are, often took on the roles of sneaking out and sneaking back in. So this wasn't escape. This was sneaking out and sneaking back in, for the purposes of bringing food into the ghetto. Now, there were also those who escaped through some of these same avenues, I guess. There were secret doors that, that didn't look like doors from the outside, but you went through a building and then you could escape, or there were holes in the walls until the Nazis realized where the holes were, then people could escape. They would also get caught and killed very frequently, so it was at a very high risk. But in terms of escape, there were also people that the other thing about being in the center of town is that they had contacts. Most Jews in Warsaw had contacts with Poles, right? One way or another. They worked with Poles, they were friends with Poles, they had Poles that worked in their homes, that, they were a relatively integrated group, except for maybe the most Orthodox. But there were a lot of Jewish Poles that were quite assimilated and had lots of contacts. So people could escape, get in contact with their friends and, former employees or employers and whatnot and come back in. And then they could also then hatch plans for escape that way. Hatch plans for acquiring false papers and trying to escape and hide as a so-called Aryan. And there were a fair number of people that in Warsaw, non-Jewish people that agreed to help Jews, to help them for a short period of time, to come and stay at their home while they found a better place to go, or sometimes for years on end, allowing them to, live in a bunker or to live in a farmhouse or to live in a attic or, whatever kind of thing they had available. So, and there were also organizations, some of the convents, for example, orphanages would at times allow Jewish children to come to them and to hide, pretend to be Aryan. So there was a lot of, because it was so large and because there were so many people, this was happening a lot. And I have a book that tells me the numbers, but it's tens of thousands of Jews that were in hiding on the Aryan side and survived in hiding on the Aryan side, not in hiding, on the Aryan side, right? And I say Aryan because these are like made up Nazi racial concepts, who's Aryan and who's Jewish.
Right.
Aryan is basically German for all intents and purposes here. And the Aryan side is just what they called Warsaw, that wasn't in the ghetto. So there were people hiding there, and there were people going back and forth for different reasons. But there were also groups of people, blackmailers, who made it their job. You ask, why didn't people escape? First of all, they had to know somebody. They had to have somewhere to go, right? You couldn't just like escape and then
Wander
live,
the streets.
yeah, wander the streets because everybody would know you were Jewish. Maybe you looked Jewish, but even if you didn't, you had to have papers that said that you weren't Jewish. And it wasn't easy and it wasn't cheap to get those kinds of papers. So you had to have contacts to get the papers in the first place. And then you still couldn't wander the streets. You had to have an employer, you had to have somewhere to go. And then on top of that, even if you had all of those kind of connections, you could be accosted by blackmailers. And blackmailers were again, a relatively large group of people who made it their job to find Jews that were not in the ghetto and to return them to the Nazis or either to return them if they couldn't pay or to blackmail them, right? So to get everything they could out of the Jewish people. There was also the stereotype, the myth that all the Jews were rich. And in Warsaw, all the Jews were not rich. But this was, has always been and continues to be a stereotype about Jewish people. So a lot of the blackmailers thought, oh, I can get a lot from these Jews. They're hiding their diamonds, they're hiding their money. And I'll just threaten them, right? I'll turn you in if you don't give me X, Y, and Z. And if they didn't give them X, Y, and Z, and sometimes even if they did give them X, Y, and Z, they could turn them into the Nazis at any time and they would be either returned to the ghetto or killed or imprisoned. So there was real danger aside from, having to have everything in place to get out in the first place, to get out without being seen through one of these kind of secret ways, and then to not be caught by a blackmailer. That was a lot. That was a lot of steps that people had to go through in order to safely escape. And then, say you escaped in 1941, the war doesn't end until 1945. So then you have a lot of years of it's very few stories of people that escaped and then lived in the same place, hidden from 41 or 42 to 45. Even in Eastern or Western Europe, where it was a little bit easier, maybe,
Yeah,
but certainly not in Poland.
right. But even, for example, in the Netherlands, they had to change hiding places frequently. They were afraid of being reported on, or just people would hear. Yeah. So the same thing in Poland. Just because you finally got out successfully on that one day didn't mean that you would survive.
And you probably most likely wouldn't. I mean, that's what the numbers tell us. So yes, so it's possible in Warsaw at least to get out, but then everything afterwards was virtually impossible. And then in places like Lodz, it was impossible to get out at all. So there were challenges.
Now, what about information? In the Warsaw Ghetto, did they understand better the risk if they didn't get out than they did in Lodz, where they thought they didn't have as much information, so they thought maybe they would be safer.
Yeah. The problem is that they started deporting people from Lodz earlier. And for example, deporting them to Chelmno, which was the first place where they were doing mass killings using gas, although it was carbon dioxide, no,
Yeah,
monoxide, the dangerous one,
yeah,
carbon
in vans.
monoxide poisoning in gas vans rather than gas chambers that came later. So in fact, in some ways they might have known more in that people were leaving and not coming back and in fact then their clothes and things would be sent back to the ghetto for processing and so it
Mm.
became pretty clear that they were not surviving that um although I'm trying to remember the date on I'm thinking of diary entries where they talk about that and I can't remember the
No,
date
but that
so
can I repeat that? That's interesting because I was thinking, well, how did they know if there were no survivors? But the clothes were sent back, and some people would have recognized the clothes.
exactly. Actually, if you give me 1 minute, I can see if it's easy for me to find this because it's in my notes about my diaries this moment at which and then people were writing about how the clothes came back and yeah exactly people were recognizing that there was whatever their mother's dress and so forth and the story was always that people were being sent to work but obviously if they were sent to work why would their clothes come back to then be cleaned and processed and sent to Germany, right? That was the whole idea. And that didn't make logical sense. So people started to get a sense of what was
What
going
was going
on. So let me just see if I can find this quickly. And if not, we will move on because I do wonder about the date of that, because there is some discussion about who knew what and when. And there's certainly diary entries from Warsaw that say, thank God we're not like Lodz and people in Warsaw being worried about their friends in Lodz. And I think because it was more shut down, because it was closed sooner, so people knew about it in Warsaw before the Warsaw Ghetto was closed. Um, there were a lot of families, like people in Poland, Jewish families lived in many different cities. So there was, at certain times, there was mail that went back and forth. So there was some information sharing that way. But I just want to see the
Right. So one of the things
date.
Dr. Sutton saying is since the Lodz Ghetto was enclosed several months earlier than Warsaw, Warsaw Jews still living openly would perhaps be able to get some idea of what was going on in Lodz.
Absolutely, and some idea of the terrible conditions there. And then they became fearful, of course, for themselves. As first it was rumors that were coming around that maybe there would be a ghetto in Warsaw, and then eventually, of course, it came in October, and then I think it was closed in November. Or no, it came in April of 40, but it was closed
Mm.
in
No,
November.
no, no,
So
no. It was
no?
October was right.
Okay,
They
October.
were ordered in October of,
Okay.
but
1940.
yes, but it
Yeah.
wasn't sealed, which is why whenever I write it, I make it clear because again, I don't want distorters to be able to say so. Some said there's a reason. October is when they were ordered in, but it wasn't sealed, sealed until
Right.
November.
Right, exactly. All right,
And
let's
why Dr. Simon's looking that up, I'm just going to say we only have a few minutes left, and I want her to share with you the distinction that I had to learn in her class between diaries and memoirs of the Holocaust, and why a scholar of diaries, such as she is herself, how they place, I don't want to say the veracity, but how much they depend on what someone writes at that moment and someone who writes his or her memories afterwards. Did you find the
yeah.
reference you wanted to share?
I found one diary, but it wasn't, oh no. Um, it wasn't what I was thinking of. Let's see. Okay. No, I did not. So I
Okay.
apologize.
Okay, that's okay. So, can you share in these few minutes we have left, can you, this distinction, which I think I had never thought of. I mean, I read memoirs and diaries all the time, and I never thought about that I was reading two different kinds of witness statements, so to speak.
Yeah, so it's really important as we think about different types of information. There's the kind of regular source base for historians, which is official documents. So things coming from the Nazis, just kind of general information about when ghettos were created, how many there were, killing records, all these kinds of things, top down. But then there's also all kinds of sources that come from Jews, in this case, and at the time, well, so my book is about diaries, and I am very passionate about Holocaust diaries as important historical sources, not just to read as lay people, but to use in writing history because they record the perceptions of people at the moment or very soon after the moment that they are experiencing the things that they write about. And to me, and this is important. So for a long time, history and Holocaust history was very worried about veracity. I mean, it's always worried about veracity. Nobody wants to tell stories that aren't true, but that veracity was the main thing. We need to know what date did this happen? What, right? Who made what order when about the ghetto? When was it sealed? When was it, what was going on step by step? But it since like the 1980s or 90s or so, there's been what people call the cultural turn in history and in Holocaust history as well, which is we focus more on people and experiences than we do about institutions and kind of the great men, right? That it's more about the people that experience history and how they experience it. And to me, that's the key about diaries, is that in a diary, you're going to read things that may not be entirely historically accurate. And that's because people are people. People are faulty, right? They remember things wrong, they hear things wrong. We've all played a game of telephone and something goes from one place to one person to the next, and you're going to get something that maybe isn't the same as when it started. There's also lots of problems in the ghetto with information, right? Where are they getting their information? Is it from the Nazis? Is it from the Poles? Is it good information? Is it from the BBC? Is it true? Is it false? They don't know. They don't know. And so they're writing down all the things they hear, all the things they see, all the things they experience, and all the things they feel. And they're writing that all down together. So it's not to say that diaries are not good historical sources. It's just that you need to know how to read them. You need to know how to understand all those different aspects that are in the diaries and then to suss out, okay, here's the things I can verify with facts. We know that on January 2nd, 1943, X happened and they wrote about it here. Great. But when they write about how, the great example is Abraham Levin about how his whole world is destroyed because his wife was taken away.
In
You know
order.
what? Maybe she was taken away 2 hours before or 2 hours after he remembers it. I don't know. Nobody will know. It doesn't matter. What matters is his complete heartbreak and his emotional response to what is going on. And that helps us as historians and as humans to understand something about the victim experience, how they experienced what they experienced, aside from just dates and numbers and dry facts. And so that's the diaries. And then memoirs is a whole nother thing, because memoirs also, again, essential, right? We've all read Elie Wiesel, um, Elie Wiesel's Night. Even my students come to me and they've read it mainly in high school. Um, but he writes this after. And so he's already been through all the experiences. And so in memoirs, it's always about meaning making. Diaries are about meaning making too, but they can only meaning make about that day and what happened before. Memoirs are about usually then, because the whole point is they're telling their Holocaust story, maybe a little bit of now, and not really that much. It's really about how they remember now what they went through then, as opposed to then. And they're trying to make meaning. Now they know the whole, they know what happened, they know about the final solution. Like I said, there was no final solution in December of 1939. So people in the ghetto had to just write about what was happening today. They couldn't write about the Holocaust because there was no Holocaust. And so you really have a completely different perspective where people at the time are writing their experiences. So are memoirists, but they have to write it with the knowledge of everything that comes after. And they do. And it's very clear. You always, every memoir is the same in this way, where there's something about kind of before, and then something about during, and then something about after. And of course, with the diaries as well, most of these diarists didn't survive. So there's no after anyway, even if there could be. So the way you're reading is really about understanding somebody's experience as they perceive it at the moment, and then how somebody's experience, how they think back on it after they've had some time to think, some space away, and as they've gathered a lot more information from the world about what happened, not just to them, but to everybody. So it's gonna look different. It's gonna read different. It's gonna tell us different things. It's gonna tell us something about day to day, and it's gonna tell us something about memory. How do they remember? How do they choose to remember? How do they write about what they choose to remember in the memoir? And in the diary, that just is not, I mean, it's part of it. I guess, during the day, a billion things happen and they can only write about so many, but it's a
Right.
qualitatively different project than writing about something 10 years later, for
Right.
example.
Levin even says he doesn't want, as I recall from the class, he didn't want to write about his wife too much. He couldn't do it. But
Yeah.
I just wanted to also say, in a memoir, people know other people are going to read it. And so how
Yes.
they present themselves and their own actions will be colored by that. We all want to look
Yes.
like, I don't want to say a hero, but like good guys.
Yeah.
Many of the diarists, particularly the ones who weren't part of these archive projects, really wrote for themselves, did not expect to survive or that their diaries would survive. Now, whether that meant they were more honest in how they presented themselves or whether that's not true, but there is that difference possibility that they maybe admitted there. I'm thinking of one now, which escapes me, which one I'm thinking about, admitting the mistakes that he made.
Mhm.
I think was a man, could have been a woman. And as a memoir, that part might not have been included. I don't know.
Absolutely, because it's not a real time kind of coping. And I mean, it gets to big questions about diaries. Why did they write them in the first place? And some people were writing them just to keep a record, but some people were writing them really to cope with the day to day and to really delve into their own mental space, like many of us do when we write journals or diaries still today. And so in doing so, yeah, they weren't necessarily, or probably not necessarily thinking about future readers. And probably if they had thought about it, wouldn't really want somebody to necessarily read it, which is also, I mean, a challenge for us as scholars in that, how do you, is it okay to read somebody's innermost thoughts and feelings if they never intended for you to read it? Um, of course I say yes because I'm a historian. We need to know things and we need to understand things. But perhaps if you met this person, they would be pretty horrified to learn that these ideas that they wrote down when they were a teenager or something, have made it into the mainstream. And maybe I can end with that, kind of where we started with Anne Frank, which is that, um, as we know, Anne Frank's diary is the uh, most popular, most commonly read Holocaust text of all time, not just diary, but text. The only diary pretty much anybody has ever read, any Holocaust diary, maybe any diary at all, certainly any Holocaust diary that pretty much anybody has ever read, even though there are tens of Holocaust diaries that are translated into English, just by the way. They're out there, and Phyllis can attest, they're really fascinating. They're all
Yeah.
different. It's a really fascinating world to jump into, but so Anne Frank is writing her diary as a 13-year-old before they go into hiding, and then she goes into hiding, and then she's writing about her experiences in hiding and her experiences going through puberty and interpersonal relations and all of the things, and also about the Holocaust and what she hears, obviously not what she sees because she doesn't see anything, which is right, a problem with diaries, a problem, but only depending on how you're trying to read the diaries. Um, but then there's a broadcast on the BBC that says that people should be, or maybe it's on the Dutch radio. I'm not entirely sure. I think it's on the Dutch radio that says that people should be writing down their experiences for posterity. And she's been writing and she takes that on, she writes about it in the diary and she begins editing her diary for, a potential future audience. And she says throughout that she wants to be a writer. That's her greatest wish anyway. And she kind of comes to the realization that this might be, her first major writing that is more, not just about her. And what I wanted to say is that so when you read the Diary of Anne Frank, it depends what version you read. And this is the other thing. There are so many versions. The first version that was published and that was translated to English was all about her, it was her father, right, had heavily edited and, presented what he wanted the world to read. And so everybody did, and it became a play and a movie and so forth. And then there have been different editions that have added in parts that he took out. And then the most recent publication is called, of course, now I lost that, The Collected Works, Anne Frank, The Collected Works. And it includes all kinds of like side by side, her original, the diary as it was originally published, and then the added bits, and then her additions and her edits
Sure, oh
over
man.
time. So you can, if you want, get this book and be able to see all of the things, the way she wrote it, the way she changed it. And so you can get a sense of like her thought process. But again, for most diaries, that's just not a thing. First of all, they didn't necessarily go back and do that. And secondly, even if they did, there's not, the resources for most of these diaries to be able to really spend the time to put together all kinds of different parts of it. So we just kind of have what we either have in a translation or that we find in an archive if we're lucky to go to an archive and find diaries. So it's a complicated, but I think really rewarding and important thing. And it really is, the onus is on us. It's not about them and how they lied to us in their diaries. It's about us and how we read their diaries in an ethical and thoughtful
Understanding.
way.
And then an understanding of what's going on. And um, Chaim Kaplan in his Warsaw Diary says, I'm probably not quite right, but it's 5 days since real food has passed my lips. Or am I talking about Abraham Lincoln? No, I'm talking about Chaim Kaplan, right?
Mhm.
And my friends say, why are you doing this? And by the way, Chaim Kaplan does not survive. And because he has to, he is compelled to share. So we honor them by reading what they've written. And just to reinforce, these were written by both teens, which is really interesting, and adults. So we get a wide range of male, female, religious, not religious. So I highly recommend that when you want to read about the Holocaust, you consider diaries and don't poo-poo them as not historical because they're giving you what we call boots on the ground viewpoint, which is as valuable as the documents from on high. Did I say that correctly? Anyway, I want to thank Dr. Simon so much for coming on. I also want to end this by saying, for the victims and the rescuers and the upstanders who were not bystanders, who are no longer with us, may their memories be a memory forever, be a blessing forever. May their memories be a blessing forever.